everybody. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. I want to apologize in advance for any audio quality issues today. I'm still in the process of moving my home office to my old home office to my new home office, and I don't have all of my equipment set up yet. There's also quite a bit of construction going on around the house and in the neighborhood, so we'll do the best we can. I'm really excited today to welcome Jo Marchant as a guest on my show. Jo Marchant is an award-winning science journalist and author of 3 books. She trained as a scientist and has a PhD in genetics and medical microbiology from St. Bartholomew Hospital Medical College in London and a master's in science communication from Imperial College London. Jo's worked as an editor at New Scientist and at Nature and has written on topics from the future of genetic engineering to underwater archaeology. Her articles have appeared in publications including the New York Times, The Guardian, and Smithsonian Magazine. She currently lives in London. So I asked Jo to come on the show because I recently read her book called Cure, A Journey into the Science of Mind Over Body. And I mentioned it in an email recently because Jo has written extensively about the placebo effect, which is something that I've been interested in for many years and something that I don't think gets enough attention because it has some very profound implications for how we approach our own healing, how we work with our kids, when they get sick, and if you're a clinician, how you work with your patients. So I'm really looking forward to diving more deeply into a discussion about the placebo effect with Jo. So let's get to it. This episode of Revolution Health Radio is brought to you by 144.me. 144 is a diet and lifestyle reset program I created to help you dial in the 4 pillars of health: nutrition, physical activity, sleep, and stress management. Whether you want to lose weight, boost your energy, treat a chronic health problem, or just maintain your current good health and extend your lifespan, these are the 4 areas you need to focus on before anything else. In the 14-4 program, I walk you through every step of the process, from cleaning out your pantry and shopping for the right foods, to recipe and meal plans, to video demos of workouts that you can do at home without any special equipment, to guided meditation and stress management programs, to daily sleep tips, to personalized recommendations for what to do after you finish the reset. 14-4 is a great option whether you're just getting started with this stuff or you've been on the path for a while. In fact, I do a 14-4 myself 3 or 4 times a year to hit the reset button and give myself a boost. To learn more about how 14-4 can help you achieve your health goals, head over to 144.me. Okay, now back to the show. Jo, thank you so much for being on the show. I've really been looking forward to speaking with you.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show.
So before we dive into placebo and your book, I'd love to just learn a little bit more about your background and how you became interested in, let's call it, mind over body, as you did.
Okay, so I'm a scientist by training. I have a PhD in genetics and medical microbiology. So I started out as a very black and white scientist, I guess you could say. I want to see the evidence. I want to understand mechanisms and, look at the trials behind things to really understand them. And I was just writing about, a lot of different areas of medical research in my work as a science journalist, because since doing my PhD, I've been an editor and science writer for about 15 years, probably. And it just seemed to me that there were certain questions that science wasn't doing a great job at answering. We all know from experience that our mental state can have quite dramatic physical effects. When we're stressed or nervous, for example, that can have a real effect on your gut. If you're narrowly missed by a car, you feel your heart race. Even if you just think about biting into a lemon, you often get that tingling feeling at the back of your mouth where your salivary glands are starting to work. So we know that there are effects of the mind on the body, but when it comes to whether that influences health, it just seems to that question gets much more controversial. You get a lot of sort of exaggerated claims of miracle cures and healing thoughts. And on the other side, you get skeptics insisting that there's no role for the mind whatsoever in health. So that just really intrigued me. I wanted to look at what the evidence really is. What are scientists finding out about this?
So we find ourselves in a particular period of time, and we have, of course, particular attitudes about these things at this point in time. But it wasn't always this way, was it? I mean, it seems to me that, maybe even just 100 years ago, there was a much greater appreciation of the role of the mind in healing and health. And the advent of the randomized clinical trial and the appreciation of that in medicine, which has been really positive in a lot of ways, has also influenced or maybe changed the way that we look at the role of mind in healing. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you're right, but I think there are several things going on. So yes, centuries ago, it was taken for granted that the mind and body were entwined, and that that your mind was very important for your physical health. And several things have happened. In science, the sort of separation between mind and body goes back to the French philosopher René Descartes in the 17th century, where there were kind of battles between science and the church over sort of who had the right to knowledge, if you like. And so he kind of came up with this solution which said that physical objects, sort of measurable physical matter, were sort of an appropriate topic for scientific inquiry, whereas the sort of ephemeral soul and spirit, if you like, couldn't really be studied scientifically and was sort of left to the church. And that isn't really how we look at the mind and body now. Most neuroscientists would say that the mind and brain are entwined. You can't really have a thought without some physical change occurring in the neurons of your brain. But that hangover from Descartes, this idea that mental phenomena, our sort of thoughts, emotions, and beliefs, just aren't as real as physical objects and matter, that still pervades a lot of science, I think. And then there were various medical advances, the invention of the autopsy, for example, where doctors could start to diagnose conditions by looking sort of physically at the dead body to see what had gone wrong with it, looking for structural changes. And that kind of became more important than the patient's subjective report of how they felt. Microscopes, for example, different diagnostic tests have all shifted medics towards this sort of physical, structural framework in terms of looking at what's gone wrong rather than listening to patients. And then you're right, the randomized controlled trial in the 1950s. So we test medicines now against fake medicines or placebos, and that's really important that we do that. That's been a really fundamental advance in medicine and means we don't get fooled. We can check whether medicines work or not, and that has saved a lot of lives. But at the same time, it means that we kind of automatically discount everything about a treatment apart from the direct biochemical effect of that drug. So everything to do with how that treatment is delivered, the interaction with the medical practitioner, the patient's sort of hopes and expectations and beliefs, all these other things get sort of discounted, and we don't have any way to measure or value those. So I think that has really pushed away from the concept of sort of doctors delivering care to this focus on the physical drug and treatment.
Right, to the point where there's even a suggestion that care will be kind of automated and run, done by an algorithm or an app, and can be done just as efficiently, which some have actually argued that it's just a question of making a diagnosis based on certain criteria and then making a prescription, and the doctor may not even necessarily need to be involved in that process in some cases, which I think is really overlooking this, what we're going to be talking more about today. So we have this Cartesian dualism that's informed allopathic medicine, or really been the basis of it from the beginning. And then we have the autopsy and the randomized clinical trial. It's interesting to me that one of the doorways back into this connection between mind and body, if we can even say that there's a connection, because really that implies there's a separation in the first place, but is this placebo effect, because it's something that has been denigrated for so long, and we, it shows up in the language around it, like null and sham and dummy treatment, and these words that are not really positive words. And if you're looking at it from the perspective of a drug company, the placebo effect is your nemesis. It's not something that should be celebrated or explored from the perspective of how we can use it. So I would love to spend the rest of the time talking about the placebo effect as an example of this mind-body interrelationship. And maybe we could start with 3 or 4 of your favorite examples of the power of the placebo effect.
Okay. But yeah, first of all, just to say, I think you're absolutely right that the placebo effect has this sort of negative reputation as something where we're being deluded and it's all about fake pills and it seems a bit suspect. But actually, I think this research is fundamental because the placebo effect is basically everything else other than the direct biochemical effect of the pill. So it becomes everything to do with our mental state and attitude and the care and the social support we're receiving and how stressed we are. All of those things to do with medical care are kind of have been sort of dumped in and discounted as part of the placebo effect. So I think it really is a route into something fundamentally important about medical care. So examples. Well, in the first chapter of the book, I talked to Bonnie Anderson, and she's in her 70s, and she lives in Minnesota, and she slipped on wet tiles in her kitchen floor and broke she fractured a vertebra in her back. She had a fractured spine. And so she took part in a clinical trial for a promising new surgical procedure called vertebroplasty, where cement is injected into the fractured vertebra to strengthen it. And this was a few years ago, becoming incredibly popular, getting quite dramatic results. Patients were really benefiting from it. And so Bonnie took part in this trial. Afterwards, she told me it was like a miracle. The pain went. She was a keen golfer. She hadn't been able to play golf. She couldn't stand up to do the dishes. She couldn't sleep at night. And all of these things she was then able to do again. And then you're going to guess what's coming. It turned out that she was in the sham surgery group, the placebo group. So she'd actually received fake surgery. So we often think about fake pills when it comes to placebos, but it's any kind of medical treatment if you have a kind of fake version of it. And she still benefited. And the trial as a whole, and actually 2 different trials were carried out at about the same time, both showing similar results, where there was no difference between the real vertebroplasty and the fake vertebroplasty, which was carried out in exactly the same way, except that the cement wasn't injected. But both groups did really well. So it's kind of showing you that placebo effects aren't just to do with sort of things like headaches, or they go across all different sorts of conditions, and it's not just to do with pills, it's surgery as well. And in fact, generally with surgery, you get bigger placebo responses because part of what seems to feed into the placebo effect is how impressive a treatment is, if you like, how much expectation it's creating in the person that they're going to be feeling better. So surgical techniques can be extremely effective.
Yeah, I remember reading a study a while back from Dr. Bruce Mosley, who was an orthopedic surgeon who had done studies indicating that placebo surgery can be as effective as the real thing for knee surgery. And I think I even saw an interview with a patient from one of those surgeries. It was a guy who was, basically like in a wheelchair before the surgery. He could hardly even walk. And then it showed him playing basketball with his son after the surgery. And then it came, it was a TV interview, I think. And it came around and, same kind of story that you just told, where he had this dramatic improvement. And then he realized after the surgery, he was told that he was in the placebo group. And it actually had a profound effect on him, because he realized that his mind and his belief could have such a powerful influence on his body, and he had almost kind of like a spiritual awakening kind of experience through that process. I mean, he was someone who had not really thought about those things at all before, and that's kind of an interesting thing about placebo effect to me as well, is like, what it can tell us as individuals about our own capacity to heal or to shift our perception of our symptoms, which is large, I think to a large extent what the placebo effect is about, or can tell us in terms of how we approach illness. So I'd love to, hear, there are so many good examples in your book. It's hard to pick a few, but any others that stand out for you?
Yeah, there's some really interesting research coming out of Harvard, trying to tease apart different components of the placebo response. So looking at patients with chronic arm pain, for example, or there's others with irritable bowel syndrome. And for example, comparing, so everybody gets placebo acupuncture, which is where you put the needles in the wrong places so they don't fully penetrate the skin. And then comparing, for example, a warm empathic practitioner with a cold but polite practitioner. And the patients have dramatically better relief from their symptoms if the practitioner is warm and empathic. Or there's another one in acid reflux disease showing that patients do much better, even if everyone has placebos, if they have a long consultation with their physician with lots of personal questions compared to a short standard consultation. So in terms of teasing out what are the factors that feed into placebo responses and what helps to maximize placebo responses. That's really interesting. And then I guess my third example would be there's a study looking at ulcer medication, so comparing trials for the same ulcer medication in different countries and showing that the placebo response rate varies dramatically. So in Denmark, for example, 59% of people respond to the placebo. So in the clinical trials, they're getting the placebo. And then in trials of the same drug in the placebo group in Brazil, only 7% of those people respond to the placebo. So that's starting to show you that sort of cultural beliefs and attitudes as well can be important. It's not just about your own individual expectations. So yeah, I found that one fascinating too.
Right. That reminds me of the one where the color, we know the color of the pill affects the outcome of treatment, and that differs from culture to culture. I think in Italy, blue placebos make excellent sleeping pills for women, but had the opposite effect on men. And when they eventually figured out that was because the Italian soccer team's color is blue, which gets the men really excited.
Yeah, exactly. So, and what that tells you is it's nothing to do with the pill itself. That's a sugar pill. It's not doing anything. It's all about what that treatment means to you. And so, because of all these different results, things are different in different places and different people, has kind of given the placebo effect this sort of reputation as being a bit slippery, maybe not really real. But as soon as you turn it around and say, no, this is about what the treatment means to each individual person, then it makes complete sense that placebo surgery might be more effective than a placebo pill, or that a blue pill will have a different effect, in one person compared to another. So yeah, I think that's the real insight from that study.
Right. And that's why Ted Kopchak says the idea of placebo, the definition of it as an inert substance, is complete nonsense, I think was the exact phrase you used in the book.
Yeah, because an inert substance doesn't do anything. What's doing it is your mind and what what that treatment means to you. Yeah.
So I think another misconception about placebo is just that it somehow kind of alters our perception of things without really causing any measurable changes in the body. But we know that that's completely untrue now. Can you talk a little bit about some examples of that? And, I think you mentioned in the book some neuroimaging studies, I think, related to Parkinson's, and some studies of endorphin production related to placebo.
Yeah, so this was one of the things that really surprised me, actually, when I started looking into placebo studies, that when people respond to a placebo, what's causing that are actually biological changes, measurable changes in the brain that are very similar to those that are caused by drugs. So yeah, for example, placebo painkillers can trigger a release of endorphins in the brain. These are natural pain relieving chemicals, and they're actually the chemicals that opioid drugs, things like morphine and heroin, are designed to mimic. So if you respond to a painkiller and you feel if you respond to a placebo and feel that it eases your pain, you haven't imagined that. That's not all in your mind. That is caused by exactly the same physical change as would occur if you took the actual drug. And then with Parkinson's, for example, when patients take a placebo Parkinson's drug, you see a flood of dopamine in the brain. This is the neurotransmitter that they are missing, that they will get if they take their drug. There are even studies with altitude sickness showing that you can give people fake oxygen and see a reduction in neurotransmitters called prostaglandins. And these do things like they dilate blood vessels, they increase our sensitivity to pain, and they cause many of the symptoms of altitude sickness. So again, the altitude sickness is being eased by a very real, measurable sort of physiological mechanism. So Fabrizio Benedetti, he's a neuroscientist in Italy and one of the sort of pioneers of placebo research. He often says there is not one placebo effect, there are many. So the mechanism is different for every condition that you look at. And researchers are only just starting to kind of get a handle on that. There are sort of certain key ones like pain, Parkinson's, depression is another one that are quite well studied, and they're only just starting to discover about other ones. But the key point here is that, yes, it's not imaginary. These are real biochemical changes, often very similar to the ones caused by drugs, that are underlying these changes in symptoms.
That's really fascinating to me. And it, I think from what I've gathered in the research literature and also reading your book, it also points to one of the main understandings of how placebo works is by altering our own innate responses. So, it's boosting chemicals or neurotransmitters or hormones that we produce on our own. And the idea is that placebo can't, do anything that involves bringing some chemical or something from outside of the body, of course. So the understanding has been so far that means that placebo won't really fundamentally change any, lead to any healing, like a healing of an underlying cause, or really change something fundamental in the body. It's just going to mostly change our perception of it and our experience of what's happening. But then you had a chapter in your book that raised some examples of where that may not actually be the case. And in fact, the placebo effect may be able to alter underlying physiology and possibly even, dare I say it, heal disease. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we've been talking so far mainly about sort of symptoms or conditions that we're consciously aware of. So things like pain, fatigue, nausea, depression, and placebo responses here can be quite large. Gut problems is another one. And here it seems that, just the sort of conscious knowledge that you've received treatment can create quite large changes in the symptoms that you experience. And as I said, that's underpinned by these biological, physical changes. But a kind of very new realization, really, in this field is that there is another class of placebo responses which can actually influence things like the immune system, so immune responses, levels of hormones in the body. So starting to really get at the physiological process of disease. And in a lot of these cases, it seems that simply the sort of conscious belief of having taken a drug or expecting to feel better doesn't seem to be enough. What causes these changes is learned associations. So if you've taken a drug in the past that has a particular physical effect on your body learns that response, so that then in the future, if you take a placebo, it will automatically trigger the same response. But it won't happen if you just took a placebo for the first time. You have to have had the drug in the past for your body to learn how to respond to it. It's called Pavlovian conditioning. I don't know if any of your listeners would have heard of Pavlov's dogs,
I think
where
so.
the Russian physiologist taught his dogs to associate being fed with a light flashing or sound of a buzzer, for example, until eventually they would salivate just in response to the light or buzzer. So that's a learned association. And that works on people. And yeah, it works on immune responses, it works on hormone levels. In Parkinson's patients, for example, that seems to be, there's some very new research suggesting that that's actually what's underlying their placebo responses rather than just the conscious belief. But it gets quite complicated. The two work together because if you've received a drug in the past, obviously that also strengthens your conscious expectation. So there are different things all entwined here. But I think this starts to get really exciting because you can start to influence physiological processes in the body. And there's some very interesting research, for example, with organ transplant patients, looking at whether we can sort of teach the body the response to immunosuppressant drugs. So then you can use placebos to suppress the immune system. And that really helps to reduce drug doses, which is important because their drugs are incredibly toxic and toxic to, so in kidney transplant patients, for example, the drugs are toxic to the kidney, the very organ that you're trying to save. So being able to reduce drug doses is critical for these people. So it's not a question of, we can do without drugs completely, but by using the two things together in a smart way, we can hopefully use sort of psychological cues in the mind to then reduce the doses of the drugs that we need to take.
Right. I thought that was one of the most exciting possible applications of this. And I remember the study you wrote about in the book. You correct me if I'm get any of the details wrong, but they're basically using this principle to reduce the effective dose of the medication needed to have this effect. And they're using certain things like, strong colors and music to create the association between the placebo and the active substance, so that over time, as long as those associations are present, let's say like a patient drinks a placebo liquid that's bright green while they're listening to one of their favorite songs, and along with the active medication, over time they can gradually reduce the level of active medication and increase the amount of placebo. As long as it's bright green and they're listening to that music, they'll still get the same effect as if they were taking the full dose of the active medication.
Yeah, they have this bizarre drink. It's actually strawberry milk mixed with lavender oil and green food coloring.
Right.
It's really disgusting, actually. But the idea is to have something incredibly distinctive
Novel.
and new that you would never have experienced before, that you won't forget, and take that alongside your drug a few times, so that then when they have the drink on its own, you see that same immunosuppressant effect.
Right.
And they've shown that now in trials with healthy volunteers, and they're just starting to look in transplant patients. But I focused on the transplant patients because that was an ongoing study, but there's also work in people with autoimmune disease, for example, everything from psoriasis to multiple sclerosis. The work's at quite an early stage, but it looks like it could be a really promising effect in starting to bring down drug doses, and even potentially in cancer as well. There are some cancer drugs where they've shown that you can do this conditioning, this learned association with the drug, to then have the same effect with a placebo. And again, with chemotherapy, if you could reduce drug doses, that would be incredibly important.
This raises, of course, an interesting question about ethics. Some researchers or clinicians have claimed that placebo surgery is unethical because then the people who are receiving the placebo aren't receiving the active surgery. But one of the researchers, this might have been in your book or somewhere else, or a physician, said it's actually unethical not to do that, because if you can provide a treatment that has almost zero side effect, chance of any adverse complications, that does the same thing as the active treatment, which actually has significant risks, then it's unethical not to do that. But it seems like we're going to have to adjust our approach a little bit, or our thinking around this, because now there are trials with what are called honest placebos, right? Where patients are even told that they receive a placebo, and you would think that wouldn't work at all because of the idea that placebo is based on our beliefs, but that's not exactly true, is it?
Yeah, that's right. So there are trials now in irritable bowel syndrome, migraine headaches, depression, ADHD, showing that, you can give people placebos. They know it's a placebo and it still has an effect. It isn't always necessarily as good as a placebo that you think is a real treatment, but it's significantly better than no treatment. And there are several possible reasons for that. One is that they might be working partly through these learned associations that I was just talking about. And the thing about these learned associations is your conscious expectation doesn't matter. Your body does this automatically. So that could be one thing that's going on, even with things like pain. Another is that it's just simply being treated, being part of a trial, receiving treatment, being looked after, even if there's nothing in the treatment that you're getting, just that feeling of being sort of safe, supported, looked after, is doing something at a deeper level, perhaps, that is helping to sort of create these changes and ease those symptoms. So it's not just the sort of surface expectation of getting better. It's something deeper about feeling cared for. That's the important thing. And I think that some of the studies that I mentioned before about looking at the attitude of the practitioner, for example, and the length of the consultation, are starting to show that all of those factors are important too.
Right, and that's, you mentioned the IBS acupuncture trial where, the treatment that was performed with just kind of polite but cold affect, they did receive a response, but it was nowhere near as high as the one that was, where they spent a lot of time and were really caring and empathetic with the patient. And I've seen lots of other trials with similar results. Let's talk about the flip side of that, though, which is the Nocebo effect. There are studies that show that, if a doctor, if you do a study and you separate patients into two groups and you give them both placebo and you don't say anything about side effects to one group, and then to the other group you say, you could experience a headache and you might have some digestive discomfort. What happens there?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. You start to see the side effects in the people getting the placebo. And this is something that's a problem in clinical trials generally, that a lot of people drop out of clinical trials because of the side effects who were in the placebo group. And so a large proportion of the side effects we experience are just down to our expectation that we might get them. So that is an argument perhaps not for reading through that long list of side effects when you take a medication.
And we're talking about really large differences too. Like there was one for I think it was erectile dysfunction, maybe if I'm remembering correctly, and it was something like the people who weren't told anything about it, it was like 7 or 8%, and people who were told it was, I don't know, above 40%. Am I remembering that correctly?
It was something like that, yeah. So there's one study that showed men who'd been prescribed a beta blocker for heart disease, and this particular drug has erectile dysfunction as a side effect. And amongst the men who didn't know what they were taking, didn't know about the side effects, 3.1% of them suffered from erectile dysfunction. But amongst the men who did know what they were taking and knew that this was a side effect, 31.2% of them suffered erectile dysfunction. So 10 times as many. So if that was to carry over into the rest of clinical practice, that's suggesting that, perhaps only a tenth of the side effects that we're experiencing are actually down to the drugs, and the rest are down to the Nocebo effect.
Which leads to another ethical conundrum. And I actually saw a paper about this. Maybe you referenced it in your book, or I came across it elsewhere, but it was a question about informed consent. As clinicians, when we prescribe a treatment to a patient, we are ethically informed consent holds that we should inform them of the relative risks and benefits of the treatment, including potential side effects and complications. But now, knowing what we know about nocebo effect, is that really the best strategy to tell patients exactly all of the side effects that they could experience taking the drug? I mean, on the one hand, now we know that doing that is effectively going to increase the chances that they could experience those side effects, but not doing it also seems, somewhat unethical, because then you're just someone is going into the treatment blind. It's an interesting conundrum to me.
Yeah, I think we do need more research into the effects of this. But I think you can still be honest. So I think we have to sort of tell people about side effects, but how you tell people and the wording you use and when you tell them can make a big difference. And even, for example, there are some studies showing that people undergoing invasive medical procedures that they're sort of conscious for, so things like breast biopsies, for example, or some forms of tumor destruction are done while people are conscious. And if the medical staff say, oh, this is going to hurt, which they're very fond of doing, they showed that dramatically increases the pain and anxiety that those people feel immediately afterwards. And even saying things like, oh, this will only hurt a little bit, all the patient hears out of that is hurt.
Yeah, no one believes
the pain
that.
Still jumps up. So those researchers were suggesting that actually what you should do is tell people about exactly what's going to happen and what might hurt or not hurt in the informed consent phase before the medical procedure. But once you get into the medical procedure, they're saying you should strip out all of that negative language, not say anything about pain, tell people what's happening, but without those judgments about how much it's going to hurt them. And they've done studies showing that this really does help to reduce people's levels of pain and anxiety, which in turn reduces the amount of sedatives and painkillers they need, and perhaps even the complication rates. So it's just part of a different attitude towards how we convey this information, and the realization that it does matter for outcomes, the words that you use and how you say these things.
Absolutely. And I've noticed that as a parent, like since I've become aware of this, like if we have to take our daughter to get a blood test or something like that, we'll take exactly that strategy. We'll explain what's going to happen to her beforehand. But when the time comes to do it, we're just very matter of fact about it. And we don't go into, a lot. We don't say things like, oh, this is only going to hurt a little bit. Because, of course, kids figure that out very quickly, that's a code word for this could hurt a lot. And it's interesting to watch how differently our daughter behaves when we talk about it that way, or when we take that approach. So
I agree. I'm very different with my kids now. I'm very aware of how I can sort of implant things just by the words that I use. So I'm very careful in exactly the same way. And also when I'm giving them medicines, or even just kissing better a scraped knee or something, I try and do that with a lot more care and attention, and telling them how that's going to help them. And also the power of distraction as well. That's something else that I look at in the book, and the very real effects that can have on pain, even for severe burns patients going through very agonizing pain. So yeah, that's a related phenomenon.
Yeah, I'd love to just spend the last few minutes here talking a little bit more about that, because the last thing I want people to think is that this is all kind of philosophical and theoretical. It doesn't have any real practical application, because it really does. And I've already, as I said in the beginning, I've thought a lot about this in terms of how I approach patients, but also in my own, practices, how I take care of myself, how I take care of my daughter. You mentioned one example of, when you're giving some medicine, if you say, this is really going to help you, it's powerful medicine, and I think it's going to stop you from coughing and you're going to feel so much better. I mean, that actually, we know now, can have a real measurable impact.
Yeah, and I think most parents kind of know intuitively that works on their kids.
Mm-hmm.
But what the studies are showing is that these things matter for all of us, not just children. And I don't think it's a case of, we give up on the physical drugs and we just need placebos.
Right.
It's using the two together. So we have the best of both worlds. So we still have the physical drugs and treatments, but by understanding some of these factors, we can try and maximize the placebo responses we have to those active drugs, because obviously you don't just get a placebo response with a placebo, you get them with the real drugs as well. So by knowing that the expectations that we have are important, so trying to engage with any treatment that you're receiving, for example, and focusing on it and asking yourself if you feel positive about it. So I spoke to a neuroscientist who researches placebo responses in depression, for example, and saying that they're realizing that the patient's attitude to an engagement with the treatment is part of their road to recovery. And if they're feeling reluctant and not positive, is that you need to find a way of asking yourself how you can overcome that reluctance, or there's not really much point in having the treatment, or perhaps there'll be a different treatment approach that would appeal more. So those things are all important. It's not just a case of the passive patient just receiving whatever the doctor gives to them. As patients, our own attitude and engagement is important. And also just the social support, finding a practitioner that you respect and trust and feel that you have a bond with, that's going to matter. So yeah, there are all sorts of practical ways in which we can hopefully do better with the drugs that we are taking.
Right, because that relationship with the practitioner is something that helps determine your belief in or enthusiasm for a treatment, and which can affect the treatment outcome. And one thing I saw, back in my own period where I was dealing with chronic illness myself, my intuition or my kind of initial response was to seek out as many opinions as possible, and had a period of time where I was seeing a number, maybe 2 or 3 practitioners at once, and I was getting different information from each of them. And what I eventually realized was that was a really bad strategy, because it was, each different advice from different practitioners was kind of making me doubt whatever treatment that I was doing. And without even knowing any of this research at that time, I knew that was having a negative effect. And just choosing one path and committing to it and really engaging with it as much as possible was something that helped a lot in my recovery process. There's a story you tell in the book I'd love you to talk a little bit here about, which is, and it comes out of this understanding that placebo can be helpful even when we know it's placebo. So there are companies now that are selling placebo medications online. And I'm not recommending that anybody do this and stop taking their active medication. Of course, you need to talk to your doctor about that. But you, I think, went ahead and ordered a placebo medication and took it for some pain you were having, and it actually helped you. Is that right?
Yeah, well, so yeah, I had these placebo capsules. They're like sort of blue and white gelatin capsules. They look like the drugs that you would buy at the pharmacist. But yeah, they're empty. There's nothing in them, but they're packaged beautifully. And it's that, and the company is called A Placebo, and they're very clear about what's in them, and they're placebos. But I'd seen the studies on honest placebos working, so I thought I'll give it a try. So yeah, I just had a splitting headache one evening. My kids were sick. I just about got them to bed. I was going to have to work all evening. So I just thought, I can't afford to have this evening blown out. Let's give it a try. So
Why not?
I had them in the cabinet where I have my other pills. I stood there in the kitchen, took them with a glass of water, trying to imagine those endorphins, flooding into my brain. And about 15, 20 minutes later, the headache did go. And, on its own, that doesn't mean anything. It's maybe my headache wasn't going to last very long anyway. But I did think it was interesting, because that is also shown in trials that honest placebos can still have an effect. And I found it quite empowering, really. I think just to realize the role that our brain plays in sort of controlling and creating the symptoms that we experience. We don't, we have to listen to our symptoms. They're important and they could be telling us about medical problems, but we don't have to be ruled by them. By changing our our attitude towards them, if you like, we don't have to be as scared of them, and we still, can have some control and carry on and do the things that we want to do.
I remember I had one of my favorite doctors in the course of my recovery process. He actually handed out a sheet to his patients that it was titled something like how to take your medicine, and he recommended creating kind of a ritual around it, where you sat down and before you swallow the pill, you kind of sit with it and envision the outcome that you would like to happen. And it all sounds very woo-woo, really, unless you understand the real research behind the stuff, and that kind of approach makes a really, we now know, measurable difference in the outcome.
Yeah, I've heard exactly the same from researchers. Yes, they recommend, make a ritual out of it, take your pills at the same time and same place each day, sit down, focus on it, think about the improvement you want to see. And I think it's just part of realizing that we need to take an active role in our own health, not just sort of blindly take the prescription and swallow the pills and carry on, but actually take part in that process.
Mm-hmm. Well, so far we've been talking all about the placebo effect, but that's not only what your book is about. You also cover a lot of other really fascinating examples of the connection between the mind and the body. I think I read your book in maybe two days. I was really fascinated by it, and it's something that I have been interested in for a really long time. So if for anyone who's interested in this topic, I really recommend Jo's book. It's called Cure: A Journey into the Science of Mind Over Body. It's one of the best science books I've read in a long time, and as you all know, that's no small thing. I generally read about 2 science books a week. So, Jo, it was a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much. And what's next for you? Do you have any other books planned, or what are you working on these days?
This is still keeping me quite busy, actually, this book, but
Right.
I'm also really interested in the effect of the body on the mind, because, you can't have one without the other. It's a two-way street. So that's another area that I'd really love to go into more deeply, that I couldn't write as much about that as I wanted to in this book. So maybe that'll be the next one.
Great. Well, I look forward to that, and maybe we'll have you back on the show in a couple of years to talk about that one.
Great. Well, thank you for having me on. It was so lovely to talk to you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Take care. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresser L.A.C. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.